Nobody has become a very popular word. Maybe some of you remember 1973. A lot of you weren't around then, but maybe you remember My Name is Nobody, Terrence Hill. He was a gunfighter who could slap those who were trying to have a gunfight with him faster than they could pull their gun. Maybe you remember that. And in 2021, there was a movie called Nobody. The detectives at the end of the movie are asking Hutch Mansell, "Who are you?" And he says, Me? I'm nobody. And so maybe you remember that. Matthew West, John Mark Hall, Melvin Williams, Douglas Williams, and Leonard Williams, and Bernard Herms wrote a song together that you might have heard if you listen to Christian music along. It says this: "I'm just a nobody trying to tell everybody all about somebody who saved my soul. Ever since you rescued me, you gave my heart a song to sing. I'm looking for the world to see nobody but Jesus." I like those words. Brandon Lake, Cody Carnes, and Hank Bentley, another nobody song, has got a song out right now called Ain't Nobody. And it goes like this: "Ain't nobody love me like Jesus. Ain't nobody love me this good. Ain't nobody love me like Jesus. And I know nobody could." Good Alabama song, Ain't Nobody. If you're trying to figure out where we're going with this, it may take you a minute, so don't get upset. Hang on. An example of how being a nobody can be very important is in the text that we just read. Now, it's also recorded in Matthew chapter 5. If you want to look at that one, verses 5 through 13. Let me give you some background to this. This is kind of interesting stuff to me. Maybe it isn't to you, but it'll tell you a little bit about the Roman army. So in the Roman army, right, when they first developed the Roman army, if you wanted to be a lifer, you went 16 years. And then it became 20 years. And then it became 25 years. But the last 5 years of the veteran, he was given lighter duties. He didn't have to do the stuff that you would normally have to do, and didn't generally fight in the battle. But then, after they were discharged, they got pay for 13 years. But when they first were discharged, they got a lump sum pay. And it comes out to about 3,000 denarii, and I'm assuming that's probably officer pay, but it didn't spell it out in what I was reading. But that pay, that one lump sum payout, was equivalent to $130,500 today. Not a bad lump sum. And then you got salt for the rest of your life. Now, salt was, or at least for the 13 years, you got a block of 10 pounds of salt, and then you could turn around and you could sell that. It was worth quite a lot of money back then, and the Romans got that from salt mines that they dug with slavery, if you will. The centurion's servant that's mentioned in this text is likely 60 years old or older. Now, how do you get that, Rex? I mean, it doesn't mention it all in the text. And it's not from me, it's from doctors who have studied this text and the description that it gives to it and what's going on with it. They believe that he had progressive supranuclear palsy, or PSP is what it's often called. It's a deadly palsy, but it only strikes you generally when you're 60 or over. So he was likely had been this man's servant for quite a number of years, and now he's elderly, and this man, who's not in retirement, is apparently still got him around and respects him a great deal. That's the Roman soldier, the centurion, that respects him. Apparently he had become like a father figure to the centurion. I mean, that becomes obvious as you read the text. Even though he's this unknown, sickly servant now that suddenly can't do what he once could do for the centurion. And without knowing his name, we have a great impact made, and we don't know the name of the centurion either, by the way, but we don't know the name of the man who worked for him. We don't have any idea who he was. We're pretty certain he was a Jewish guy, but that's about all. And the reason we're pretty certain is because how he had influenced this centurion. Apparently because of this older man who's now sick influence, this centurion had begun to love in ways he'd never loved before. He loved the Jewish people. He did charitable acts for the Jewish people. He made friends with the Jewish elders, and that's a big thing because that was a rare thing. He had given to and helped build a synagogue for them. And so he had developed a lot of friendships, and many of them likely made possible by this 60-plus-year-old servant who was such a good guy. He was obviously a humble man because the way he deals with Jesus when he comes to help. He's a man of faith because Jesus says that. So what we see is a nobody who influenced a somebody to do some great things. That's the message today. I'm going to keep talking though. There is nobody in the Bible more numerous than nobody. Have you ever noticed? The unnamed nobodies just in Jesus' story. The hypocrites, Matthew 6. The wise men, Matthew 2. The sower, Matthew 13. The shepherd, Matthew 18. The brother, Matthew 18. The king, Matthew 18. The householder, Matthew 20. The man with 2 sons, Matthew 21. The king, Matthew 22. The servant, Matthew 24. The bridegroom, Matthew 25. The traveler, Matthew 25. The strong man, Mark chapter 2. The rich man, Mark chapter 10. The man journeying, Mark chapter 13. The creditor, Luke 7. The good Samaritan, Luke chapter 10. The friend, Luke 11. The rich fool, Luke 12. The wise steward, Luke chapter 11. The guest, Luke chapter 14. The builder, Luke chapter 14. The king, Luke 14. The loving father and his son, Luke 15. The shrewd steward, Luke chapter 16. And the snobbish Pharisee in Luke chapter 18. Aren't you glad that's over? Hang on, I'm just getting started. Let me see if I can lay this out before you, because it's actually shocking when you begin to realize how few people are actually named and how many nobodies there are in your Bible. We want to look at the historical, we're just New Testament now, the historical unnamed nobody characters in the New Testament alone. Let me walk you through that as quick as I can. The wise men from the east that came to Jesus, Matthew chapter 2, nobody knows who they are. The sick and the lunatic men in Matthew chapter 4, nobody knows who they are. The leper in Matthew chapter 8, no name to attach them. The centurion and the servant, we don't have either name, we just talked about them. The certain scribe that's mentioned in Matthew chapter 8, we don't have any information about him. The 2 demon-possessed men in Matthew chapter 8, nothing. Palsied man and his 4 bearers, Matthew chapter 9, no names attached. 2 blind men in Matthew chapter 9, no name attached. The man with the withered arm in Matthew chapter 12, no name attached. The demonic in Matthew chapter 12, don't know anything about him. 4,000 men, Matthew chapter 15, nothing is mentioned about any of them. The lunatic in Matthew 17, the young child in Matthew 18, the rich young ruler, we don't know his name, Matthew chapter 19, the blind men in Matthew 20, the man who owned an ass in Matthew 21 that they borrowed to go into the Jerusalem, the lawyer, Matthew 22, the man who had a chamber that they stayed in for the Passover, Matthew 26, the 2 false witnesses, Matthew 26, the soldier who stripped Christ, Matthew 27, don't know him, the 2 thieves crucified on either side of him, Matthew 27, don't know who they were, one who offered the sponge, Matthew 27, don't know who he was, the saint who were raised after his resurrection, Matthew 27, don't know any of them. The centurions, Matthew 27, the man with an unclean spirit, Mark chapter 1, the maniac of the tombs in Mark chapter 5, the executioner of John in Mark chapter 6, the lad who gave his lunch, Mark chapter 6, the 5,000 men, we have nothing about any of those in Mark chapter 6, the deaf and dumb man in Mark 7, the one who cast out devils, Mark chapter 9, the young men, Mark chapter 14 and 16, the shepherd in Luke chapter 2, the widow's son in Luke chapter 7. The 70 disciples who go on their limited commission, we have almost no names of any of those in Luke chapter 11. The questioners in Luke 12 and 13. The man who had dropsy in Luke 14. The 10 lepers, no name at all, Luke 17. The Pharisee and the publican, Luke 18. The nobleman in Luke 19. The unnamed disciples, Luke 24. The ruler of the feast in John chapter chapter 2, the Samaritan in John 4, the nobleman in John 4, the infirm man in John 5, the man born blind, John 9, the Greeks that come to him in John 12, the unnamed among the 120 that are there in Acts chapter 1. We don't know hardly any of those people. The men among the 3,000, and obviously in Acts chapter 2, nobody's name. The lame man in Acts 3, the 5,000 men who come to faith in Acts 4 and Acts 5, the eunuch in Acts 8, we don't have his name, the cripple in Acts 14, and the jailer in Acts 16. And that's not everybody, but at least you've got an idea that you're not mentioned in the Bible either, and your name's not there. It's okay for people not to know your name, to just be a nobody. Because as you see, the majority of them were nobodies, just like you and me. So let's look at 3 examples of how nobodies influence, changed the world. I'm just going to give you 3 examples. Just see how people that you don't know who they were made such a difference. No name given. The unknown butler helped stop the starvation that was happening to the entire world. Had he not been there, had he not done this, and he played such a small part, you say, but he played such a small part. Yeah, but the world would have starved to death. Genesis 41, beginning in verse 9. The chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day. He remembers being in prison, right? Pharaoh about to kill him. Had this dream. Joseph interpreted the dream. You remember this now? All right, follow with me. When Pharaoh was angry with his servant and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief butler, we each had a dream in one night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted our dream for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream. And it came to pass, just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon. And he shaved, changed his clothes, and came to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. But I've heard it said of you that you understand a dream to interpret it. It took this butler we know nothing about. Had Joseph not been there to interpret the dream, the world would have starved. The worst famine that had ever hit that part of the world. Simple. How an unknown daughter helped stop the slavery that was in Egypt. Somebody we don't even know, right? Here it is, Exodus chapter 2, verses 5 through 10. Then the daughter of Pharaoh, we don't have her name. Don't know how many daughters he had, by the way. Could have had 1,000 for all we know. We have no idea. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked among the riverside. And when she saw the ark, that is the ark that little baby Moses was in, that would have probably been eaten by either a crocodile or a hippo. She saw the ark among the reeds. She sent her maid to get it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, this is one of the Hebrew children. His sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter, she caught on to this, by the way, said to her, go. So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Smart. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you wages. That's a pretty good deal, moms, to get paid to take care of your child. So the woman took the child and nursed him, and the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, because I drew him out of the water. So without that, there'd have been no Moses. This unnamed daughter saves the day. There'd have been no Moses and the slavery wouldn't have ended the way it did for Israel. So don't say, they're just a nobody. We don't know who they were. It doesn't matter. Actually, nobodies do matter. Number 3, how an unknown widow helped stop the stumbling of Israel. Israel was in a mess. They had a problem. They couldn't give up Baal. They thought, there's a bigger country above them, more powerful, more people across the world worship Baal by far than worship the Lord by far. It's hard not to do what the majority do, right? Isn't that kind of how you face it? There's pressure on you. In 1 Kings 17, verses 8 through 16, this is what happens. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. See, I have commanded a widow. Who's this widow? Who's her husband? Well, her husband's dead, obviously. Who is she? We never know. I've commanded a widow there to provide for you. We believe she's Jewish, more than likely, but that's about as far as we can go with that. So he arose and went to Zarephath, and when he came to the gate of the city, indeed, a widow was there gathering sticks. Isn't that just a happy coincidence? And he called her and said, Bring me a little water in a cup that I may drink. And you're going to remember, a drought's going on. That's expensive stuff. And as she was going, so she just did immediately. She just went in, just went to get the water. And as she was going to get it, and he saw she's doing it, he called to her and said, Please bring me a morsel of bread in your hand. Well, now that's imposing. So she said, As the Lord your God lives. So obviously she believes in the Lord. She's not a Baal worshiper. I do not have bread, only a handful of flour in a bin, and a little oil in a jar. And see, I'm gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son. So my husband's dead. I've got a boy, but I got to take care of him, that we may eat and die. And Elijah said to her, Do not fear, go and do as you have said, but make me a small cake from it first, and bring it to me, and afterward make some for yourself and your son. Now that's a lot to ask in this situation. We're over a year into a famine that's going to stretch 3 years. For thus says the Lord God of Israel, the bin of flour shall not be used up, nor shall the jar of oil run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the earth. So she went away and did according to the word of Elijah. How did she believe that? And she and he and her household, so there must have been somebody else involved there, ate for many days. The bin of flour was not used up, nor did the jar of oil run dry, according to the word of the Lord which he spoke to Elijah. The significance of all this is this. If there hadn't been this widow to take care of Elijah, because Elijah's options had run very slim now, if it hadn't been for that, he wouldn't have survived the famine that he had prayed for. So he was saved so that he could stand on the mountain with the prophets of Baal and call down fire upon the altar. How an unknown widow helped stop the stumbling that Israel was going through. You say, well, that didn't matter. Yeah. See, every piece of a puzzle actually matters, even the ones you don't know what they represent. So what we're looking at is how nobody's influence changed history. How a nobody, an unknown butler, helped stop the starvation that hit the whole world. And you say, well, it didn't matter. Yeah, it did matter. How a nobody, an unknown daughter, helped stop the slavery that was going on in Israel to the Jews. And how a nobody, an unknown widow, helped stop the stumbling that was happening to Israel and helped them recover from that idolatry. So what that really says to me, if you listen to all I've just said so far, is maybe everybody's important. Maybe that little nobody that you don't think is worth anything is the most important person in your life. Maybe every deed that we do is important in God's plan. Even the little thing, just remembering somebody. Oh, I know somebody. Maybe every hair on your head is numbered because it matters, because you matter. Some of you, that's an easy job, but that matters. Maybe every nobody is a somebody to him. I remember I was preaching in a town called Tallahassee, Alabama. Not Tallahassee, Tallahassee, Alabama. And next to Tallahassee is a little town, even smaller than Tallahassee, but it's right next door. I mean, they run into each other. It's called Carville. Couldn't even remember that until last night. Couldn't even remember the name of the town. So I was driving up to Carville one time, and then I came back, and I was coming back by, and I remember that in the middle of Carville, near this church, there was this house that was horrendous. It wasn't painted. It was falling apart. Y'all have seen them. It's the old wood look, right? You've seen that. And there's cars, not good cars, broken down cars all in the yard. You ever been to Alabama? Okay, so this was in the yard, right? Cars, and the grass is this high, right? But there's a trail, right? And there's an old guy, and I'd seen the old guy. I knew he was what we called a bum. I'd seen him many times. But this is what caught my eye that day. As he's walking up to his house, barely trudging alone, 4 or 5 dogs. He lived there alone. 4 or 5 dogs came to greet him. And I've never seen dogs more happy to see a man. Are you sure that person doesn't matter? Ernest Gordon was a Scottish POW during World War II. You've heard the bridge over the River Kwai. Well, this is the story behind that story. It was called Miracle on the River Kwai. Now, what you might not know is when they were building this railway, forced labor camp by the Japanese from Burma to Siam, 393 soldiers that had been prisoners now died every mile of that. 393 died every mile of the way. There were so many, it was so hot, so many diseases. It was a jungle. There was inadequate food. There were insects that were biting them constantly. They were exposed. They were worked and worked and worked and worked. The environment alone, just going through that distance, is enough to almost kill you. Little less to be bayoneted, which happened often. If you were just seen to be lagging just a little bit, they would either bayonet you, shoot you, or decapitate you right in front of all the other prisoners. Prisoner on prison crime escalated. The men were treated like animals, and so they began to act like animals. They attacked each other at every opportunity. If they saw one fall, they never picked him up. They stepped over him. They had no mercy in their eyes for each other. They couldn't care less for each other. They stole from each other. They hurt each other. They would curse at each other. And you can't imagine how they talked and felt toward the Japanese who was imprisoning them. The conditions, this is according to Ernest Gordon. He says, as conditions steadily worsened and starvation, exhaustion, and disease took an ever-growing toll, the atmosphere in which we lived was increasingly poisoned by selfishness, hatred, and fear. We were slipping rapidly down the scale of degradation. We lived by the rule of the jungle, survival of the fittest. It was a case of I look out for myself and to hell with everyone else. The weak were trampled, the sick were ignored and resented because he took up space. The dead were quickly forgotten. People would be crying for help, and everybody would avert their eyes and their heads and not lift a finger to help each other. They felt like they were forsaken men, and they felt like God had left them, and they hated the Japanese even worse. This is all true. None of this is being made up. And then one day, they were coming back from working because their camps were away from where they were building some of the works. And as they're walking back to the camp, one of the guards recognized that a shovel was missing. And Gordon writes this: at the end of each day, the tools were collected from the work party. On one occasion, a Japanese guard shouted that a shovel was missing and demanded to know which man had taken it. He began to rant and rave, working himself up into a paranoid fury, and ordered whoever was guilty to step forward. No one moved. The Japanese soldier began to shriek, "All die! All die!" And he cocked and aimed his rifle at the prisoners. And at that moment, one man stepped forward. The guard clubbed him to death with his rifle while he stood silently to attention. But when they returned to the camp, the tools were counted again, and no shovel was missing. Word spread through the camp like wildfire. An innocent man, and we don't even know who he was. Some nobody was willing to die to save the rest of us. Many sought answers about how to prepare for death suddenly, trying to get ready to meet God. Ernest Gordon says, unofficially, he became the camp chaplain. A small church was erected, and prayer was held nightly. Faith thrives when there is no hope but God. And God did not disappoint. The camp changed. Men began to treat each other like brothers, to care and to show kindness. Gordon writes, death was still with us, but we were slowly being freed from its destructive grip. We were seeing for ourselves the sharp contrast between forces that made for life and those that made for death. Selfishness, hatred, envy, jealousy, greed, self-indulgence, self-intelligence, laziness, pride were anti-life. Love, heroism, self-sacrifice, sympathy, mercy, integrity, and creative faith were the essence of life, turning mere existence into living in the truest sense. These were gifts of God to men. They were still hatred, but there was also love. There was death, but there was also life. God had not left us. He was with us, calling us to live the divine life in fellowship. A jungle university sprung up. Artists began to make materials. Musicians actually came forward and made their own instruments and gave recitals. Gardeners started tending beds that created herbs that they could use for medicine. The crime dropped dramatically. They quit stealing from each other or hurting each other. So complete was the transformation that when the liberation came and the soldiers came in and took over the camp for the Allies, that the skinny men that could barely stand up stood in front of their Japanese captors and said, "No more. No more. Don't hurt anybody else." The impact of one unnamed nobody that we'll only ever know up there. Somebody tell me who that rabbi was in that little country that nobody cared 2 cents worth about, had no power, had no influence. Who was that little unnamed rabbi who walked around preaching all of his life, never wrote a book, never really knew any politicians, and then one day the Romans took him out to a little hillside and crucified him? Who was that unnamed nobody rabbi? He was just the one that set the pattern that we're supposed to follow. That some unnamed nobody and some God-forsaken camp followed. Will you? Will you be the nobody? Will you sacrifice? Or does it have to be all about you? In you world? It's your choice. You know, you can't even be a Christian if you don't make this choice, because when you decide to be a Christian, you make this nobody Jewish rabbi your Lord. And you say, I'm dying to me. That's why when you say you believe in Him and you're going to change your heart, we bury the old guy. Did you bury him? Would you live the life of an unnamed nobody that gives all for everybody? It's up to you. Won't you come if you need to while we stand and while we sing?